Settle in, close your eyes and let your thoughts grow quiet. Tonight I'll take you back in time to a place both infamous and unforgettable, a corner of 18th century London that came to be known as Gin Alley. It was a place of wild intoxication, cheap spirits, desperate souls, and ultimately a city descending into chaos. This is not a tale of great kings or battles, nor of palaces or parades. Instead, it is the story of ordinary people, the poor, the broken and the weary of London, and how a drink both comforted and destroyed them. So imagine yourself walking the cobbled streets of London around the year 1720. The air is heavy with coal smoke, the Thames smells brackish and foul, and narrow lanes twist between crooked wooden houses. London is booming with trade, swelling with people, and straining under the weight of poverty. In the midst of it all, there emerges a craze that will consume the city. The drinking of gin. Gin had arrived in England earlier, during the late 1600s. Originally, it was seen as something medicinal, even fashionable. Soldiers who had fought alongside the Dutch during the wars had tasted their Ageniva, a juniper-flavoured spirit, and brought the taste home. Soon, English distillers imitated it, and the government, eager to support domestic grain use and limit imports of French brandy, encouraged production. By the 1720s, small-time distillers were making gin on nearly every street corner. At first it was cheap, cheerful and warming in the cold, damp air of London. It gave comfort to labourers after long hours of toil, to washerwomen with aching backs, to dockers with cracked hands. But very quickly, gin stopped being just a comfort. It became a plague. Imagine turning into a narrow lane called Holborn, or walking near St Giles, a poor district on the edge of the city. Here you would find one gin shop after another, often nothing more than a dark room with a crudely painted sign, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for two." The liquid was ladled out into mugs, sometimes flavoured with turpentine or sulphuric acid to make it burn. Babies were given gin to quiet their cries. Mothers sipped it to forget hunger. Men drowned their wages in it before ever bringing bread home. This was the world of Gin Alley. One of the most famous depictions of it came from the artist William Hogarth, who in 1751 published his grim engraving called Gin Lane. In it, he showed chaos and misery, a mother so drunk she let her child slip from her arms, a skeletal figure hanging from a gibbet, a crazed woman pawning her cooking pot for another drink. Whether exaggerated or not, it captured a truth that Londoners recognised. Gin was tearing the fabric of society apart. Let us pause here and simply imagine the sounds of Gin Alley, the clatter of tankards, the shrieks of hawkers calling out that they sell a Madame Geneva, as gin was nicknamed, the cries of hungry children, the heavy thump of a body falling in the gutter, and always the laughter that was too loud, too hollow, too desperate. By the 1730s, the problem was so severe that Parliament began passing what would be called the Gin Acts. These were laws meant to restrict the sale and consumption of gin. At first, the government tried to tax it heavily, hoping to make it too expensive for the poor to afford. But this backfired. Smugglers began selling gin in secret. Unlicensed sellers offered it on street corners, and violence erupted when constables tried to enforce the laws. Still, the tide of gin drinking rose higher. Some estimates suggested that by mid-century, The average Londoner was drinking more than 2 pints of gin every single week, and many drank far more. Gin was cheaper than beer, cheaper than bread, and for those in misery, far more comforting. Misery far more comforting. The nightmares of Gin Alley were not just in the cups of the drinkers, but in the consequences all around them. Drunkenness led to crime. Families collapsed under the weight of addiction. Workplaces were left without steady hands. In hospitals, cases of delirium tremens appeared, shaking, sweating men and women who saw visions and heard voices. In churchyards, the number of pauper burials rose steeply as death from gin-related illness and neglect became common. Yet it is important to understand that for many, gin was not just a poison, it was also an escape. Life for London's poor was unimaginably hard. Wages were low, rents were high, disease was constant. A few pennies worth of gin brought warmth to the body, a lightness to the mind, a forgetting of grief. Mothers who lost babies to hunger drank gin to dull the ache. Men who laboured in foul conditions drank to forget the pain. So while pamphlets railed against the evils of gin, those who drank it saw it as a cruel necessity. Picture then a tavern in Gin Alley around 1740. The room is dim, lit by a single oil lamp that smokes and sputters. The floor is sticky with spilled liquor. At one table sits a soldier, discharged from service, his uniform ragged, his head bent over his cup. At another, a washerwoman with hands raw from lye cradles, a mug of gin as if it were a baby. In the corner, 2 men argue loudly, slurring their words, while outside a child cries in the cold. The tavern keeper doesn't ask questions. He simply fills the mugs again, takes the coins and nods. To him this is business, to them it is life. And as the night grows darker, the laughter grows louder until it turns into shouting and finally into weeping. This was the nightmare of London's drunken descent. But the story does not end there, for as the decades wore on, the city began to fight back. Reformers, preachers and lawmakers pushed for stricter controls. The famous Gin Act of 1751 made it harder for small shops to sell gin, requiring licenses that were expensive and difficult to obtain. Prices rose, availability shrank, and slowly, though not immediately, the craze began to subside. The gin shops did not vanish overnight, but the wild excess of Gin Alley did begin to fade. In time, beer returned to being the common drink, while gin remained but one of many spirits. The city had survived its descent, though scars remained. Still, the memory of Gin Alley lived on, in Hogarth's engravings, in sermons and pamphlets, in the whispered warnings of parents to their children. It became a symbol of what happens when poverty, cheap spirits, and neglect all combine in a great city. A warning that even in times of prosperity, despair can drive people to destruction. So as you drift deeper into rest, imagine the faint echoes of Gin Alley fading into the distance, the clatter of mugs, the sound of drunken laughter, the cries of the hungry, the heavy tread of constables on night patrol, all dissolving now into silence as London sleeps, and you do too. As we return to the crooked lanes of 18th century London, let us walk deeper into the world of gin and into the lives of those who drank it. In the last telling, you glimpsed the general shape of the nightmare. The poor crushed by hardship, gin as their escape, and the city's descent into chaos. But to truly understand the story, we must slow down. We must look more closely at the streets, the houses, and the souls who pass through Gin Alley. Picture again the district of St. Giles in the Fields, notorious even in its own time as one of London's roughest quarters. Here the lanes were narrow, the houses leaned at odd angles, and the stench of poverty hung thick in the air. Open sewers trickled down the middle of the road. Laundry hung across the upper stories like tired banners. And beneath it all, the murmur of life carried on. Hawkers crying out, children begging, the dull clop of horses pulling carts, and increasingly, the sound of drunkenness. It was said that in these districts, gin shops were as common as bakeries. You could not walk far without finding a painted board declaring a gin sold here, or without hearing the call of a seller offering a Madame Lazmiva for a penny. The shops were often no more than dark holes, small rooms with a table, a barrel, and a ladle. Others were street vendors, women who filled mugs from jugs hidden under their shawls, men who carried trays of tiny glasses, ready to serve. And who came to buy? Everyone. That was the frightening truth. Men drank it before work and after. Women drank it while rocking children to sleep. Children themselves were given gin to quiet their hunger, or even dipped in it, for people thought it kept away lice and disease. Even infants, so the pamphlets complained, were dosed with gin by mothers who could not bear their wailing. One London writer of the time described it with horror. The people, already too numerous, are daily multiplied by this infamous liquor. For gin gives courage to the soldier, strength to the porter, wit to the poet, and success to the lover. The words were meant to sting with satire, but beneath them lay truth. Gin had become the people's companion in all things. Let us pause to imagine a single day. A young bricklayer named Thomas rises at dawn in a garret room barely large enough to stretch in. He is thin, his clothes patched, but he shoulders his tools and goes to the building site. Before starting work, he spends a penny at a nearby gin shop. The liquid burns his throat, but it warms him against the morning chill and dulls his hunger. By midday his wages are partly spent and his body aches. He returns again, spending another penny. The work becomes lighter in his mind, though his hands grow less steady. By evening, when he receives his pay, he has but two choices: bread and meat for his family, or gin to quiet his mind. Too often, the gin wins. He returns home late, stumbling, his wife weeping, his children hungry. This pattern repeats day after day until Thomas becomes one more lost soul in Gin Alley. Stories like his were not rare. They were the ordinary lives of thousands, and with them came all the consequences: poverty deepening, crime spreading, families torn apart. In the records of London's courts, we find endless references to thefts, assaults, and disturbances linked to gin. A mother pawns her only blanket to buy drink. A servant steals from her master to feed her habit. A man in delirium strikes his neighbour with a hammer, convinced he is being attacked. The churches too noticed. Preachers thundered against the oedeme and gin, warning of damnation, warning of society's collapse. Pamphlets with lurid titles circulated: The Downfall of Madame Geneva, The Drunkard's Progress, The Midnight Cry Against Gin. These tracts painted scenes of horror: mothers poisoning their babies with drink, men wasting away, women selling their bodies to afford another cup. Exaggerated, yes, but grounded in truths people could see daily. And still, The government struggled to act. The first Gin Act of 1729 placed taxes on the liquor, trying to curb its spread. But gin was too profitable. Small distillers sprang up everywhere, and enforcement was weak. Instead of stopping the trade, the act only drove it into darker corners. By 1736, a harsher Gin Act tried again, demanding high fees for licenses and punishing unlicensed sellers. But this sparked riots. People resisted, mocking the constables, smuggling barrels into cellars, and selling gin under the counter with whispered words. Some even dressed as respectable tea sellers, pouring gin disguised as hot water into mugs. For nearly 20 years, the battle raged between law and desire, and for nearly 20 years, gin seemed to win. Here, in this stretch of history, the artist William Hogarth sharpened his pen. His Gin Lane of 1751 remains one of the most haunting images of London's past. You may recall the mother, oblivious as her child falls from her arms. Around her, men and women starve, a corpse lies in a coffin, and a man gnaws on a bone like a dog. It was a nightmare scene, meant to shock, to stir moral outrage, and it worked. The same year, Parliament passed another Gin Act, this time crafted more carefully. The fees were lower, but the regulations stricter and the control tighter. Magistrates enforced the law with renewed vigour, and gradually the wild flood of gin began to ebb. Yet, even as it ebbed, the scars remained, the children raised in hunger, the families broken, the lives lost to drink. In hospitals, doctors recorded cases of what we now know as alcohol poisoning, cirrhosis, and delirium tremens. In the streets, one could still see faces marked by years of cheap spirits. Gin never truly vanished, it merely lost its dominance. And so London entered the later half of the 18th century with a new understanding, that a city, if it loses balance, can tumble quickly into despair, that poverty and cheap comfort, when combined, can unravel the threads of society. And that sometimes the greatest battles of a nation are not fought with armies, but with cups and bottles in the shadows of its own streets. But before you drift fully into rest, let us take one last walk down Gin Alley. Imagine the cobbles slick with rain, the crooked signs creaking in the wind, the glow of an oil lamp through a grimy window. Inside you hear laughter, shouts, the sound of mugs slamming on wood. For a moment you see the faces, a soldier, a mother, a child. Their stories flicker like candle flames, brief, fragile, already fading, and then silence. The tavern door shuts, the alley grows dark, and the nightmare becomes only memory. The story of Gin Alley does not end with laws and pamphlets. To truly see its shadow on London, we must look beyond the drunken alleys and peer into the wider city. For gin was not only a drink, it was a mirror, reflecting the struggles of 18th century society. Let us wander now through London in the middle years of the century, when the memory of the Great Plague still lingered, when fire had scarred the skyline, and when trade with the far corners of the world poured riches into the city, yet also deepened inequality. London was a place of extremes, elegant coffee houses for the wealthy and gin cellars for the poor, polished carriages rattling along Fleet Street, while beggars huddled in the shadows of St. Giles. To understand why gin gripped so fiercely, one must picture the daily burdens of ordinary Londoners. Craze. Imagine, if you will, the life of a laundress. She rises before dawn, her tiny room damp and cold, and hauls buckets of water from a pump in the street. The water is murky, heavy with filth, but it must serve. She boils it, scrubbing linen until her knuckles crack and bleed. The pay is little, the hours long, the body exhausted, and so at the end of the day, what can ease her pain? A penny's worth of gin. Or think of a coal heaver, his shoulders bent under the weight of sacks carried from barges along the Thames. The Thames. Black dust covers his skin, fills his lungs, burns his eyes. He coughs through the night, ribs aching, his wife anxious for rent. When he drinks gin, the pain dulls and laughter seems possible again, at least for a moment. And what of the countless children? Boys sent to sweep chimneys, crawling through narrow flues. Girls who stitched until their eyes blurred or hawked apples in the street. Hungry, weary, often beaten, they too were touched by gin. Not always drinking it themselves, though many did, but living in homes where the drink ruled, where mothers were distracted, fathers absent and food scarce. These lives made gin more than a temptation. It was, for many, the only escape. The government understood this uneasily. It was one thing for the poor to drink beer. Beer was filling, wholesome and taxed in ways that brought revenue to the crown. But gin was different. It was strong, nearly pure spirit, often adulterated with turpentine or sugar of lead to give it flavour. A single mug could overwhelm a body. A single night could ruin a week's wages. And worst of all, gin was made at home, cheaply, and sold without control. By the 1740s, London had gained a reputation across Europe for its drunkenness. Visitors from France, Germany and Italy wrote shocked descriptions of men and women staggering in daylight, of children offered cups by their parents, of the city descending into what they called undebauch. One observer declared that London was drowning itself in Geneva, as if the Thames had turned to spirits. This reputation wounded England's pride. Here was a rising empire, claiming wealth and power overseas, yet mocked at home for its lack of discipline. Pamphleteers thundered not only about morality, but about the nation's strength. How, they asked, could Britain defend itself in war if its labourers, its soldiers, even its sailors were drunk on gin? How could families prosper if wages vanished into taverns? How could a nation endure if its very children grew up in neglect? Thus, the battle over gin was never simply about drink. It was about identity, about what kind of people Londoners believed themselves to be. Let us pause for a moment in Covent Garden, bustling with market stalls. The scent of fruit and vegetables mingles with the stink of refuse. Costermongers shout their wares, gentlemen stroll with canes, eyeing actresses on their way to the theatre. And in the shadows of the arcade, a woman ladles gin into mugs from a hidden cask. Scataway. Her customers come quickly, furtively, a servant girl with coins stolen from her master's pocket, a porter eager to forget his aching back, a soldier on leave seeking courage before returning to barracks. Nearby, a constable watches. He knows the law forbids this trade. He knows the gin acts demand punishment, but he also knows the people are desperate. He hesitates. Does he seize the woman, risk a riot, perhaps take a bribe, or does he turn away, pretending not to see? Such choices played out daily, for law alone could not erase gin from London's veins, zin from London's veins. And so the 1750s saw a struggle of wills. Reformers like Henry Fielding, magistrate and writer, denounced gin as a poison that bred crime. His pamphlets argued that drunkenness was at the root of robberies, murders, and riots. He urged the government to act firmly to protect the people from themselves. At the same time, artists like Hogarth stirred the public with images that could not be ignored. His Gin Lane and Beer Street engravings contrasted ruin with prosperity, warning that a drunken nation could not flourish. Slowly, these efforts bore fruit. The Gin Act of 1751, unlike its predecessors, succeeded where others had failed. By regulating cellars more carefully, lowering duties to manageable levels, and empowering local magistrates, the law struck a balance. Gin became less accessible to the poorest, less profitable to the street sellers, and less fashionable among the middling sort. The wildest excesses of Gin Alley began at last to fade, yet the scars remained. Records from London's hospitals and parishes show the toll: thousands dead, countless children orphaned, families broken beyond repair. The gin craze, as later historians would call it, was not just a matter of statistics. It was lived in the cries of infants left untended, the tremors of bodies shaking with withdrawal, the hunger of children staring at empty plates. Still, London did not collapse. It endured as cities always. New fashions rose: coffee houses, tea drinking, even chocolate houses, each offering different kinds of comfort. Gin did not vanish, but it was tamed, becoming one drink among many rather than the tyrant of the poor. And so, as the century advanced, Gin Alley became less a living nightmare and more a memory, whispered in sermons, painted in Hogarth's dark lines, told in the tales of old constables and weary mothers, a warning passed from one generation to the next. Tonight, as you rest, imagine that warning still echoing. Imagine the narrow alleys grown quiet, the taverns shutting their doors, the cries of hawkers fading into silence. London continues, vast and restless, but Gin Alley recedes, becoming only shadow. Settle yourself, dear listener. Imagine you are drifting backward through time, carried by the slow current of memory into the heart of 18th century London. The city around you swells with noise, yet you hear it all through a soft haze, as if the voices are muffled by the fog of history, or muffled by the fog of 18. You are not walking with haste, nor rushing with purpose. Instead, you are gliding gently, as though through a dream, watching the world of Gin Alley unfold before you. The London of the early 1700s was a city in transformation. Its population had swelled beyond 500,000, making it the largest city in Europe, perhaps in the world. Ships crowded the Thames, their masts rising like a forest of bare trees, carrying the goods of empire. Sugar arrived from the West Indies, tobacco from Virginia, silks and porcelain from the East, and spices from India. Wealth flowed into the capital, but it did not flow evenly. It pooled in the houses of merchants and gentlemen, while the alleys of the poor remained dry and barren. It was into this imbalance that gin entered. Cheap, potent and easy to make, it flooded the city with a fierce swift. A penny could buy a dram, and for those with little else, those who lived 6 to a room, those who scraped by on irregular wages, those who knew hunger as a familiar guest, gin was both escape and companion. The craze was not a sudden burst, but a long fever, lasting decades, reshaping the rhythms of life and the fabric of families. Walk now with me down the narrow courts of St. Giles, or the crooked lanes of Whitechapel. Here, the houses lean forward as though conspiring, The wooden beams are weathered, the plaster cracked, and the air heavy with the mingling sense of refuse, smoke, and spirits. Children dart barefoot between puddles, their laughter quick but thin. Women sit on doorsteps with bowls of washing beside them, their hands red from cold water, their chatter interrupted by a sip from a chipped mug. Men with soot on their faces from the day's labour stumble toward the dram shops that cluster at every corner. These dram shops were not grand taverns with polished wood and warm fires. They were small, dim, and often disguised. A teapot on a table, a kettle on a fire, a friendly nod to those who knew what was really being poured. The liquid was harsh, burning the throat, but it promised warmth in the belly and a brief loosening of the burdens of life. It is easy from the distance of centuries to imagine this as merely excess, as reckless indulgence. Yet remember, dear listener, that gin answered needs. For the laundress who scrubbed linen until her hands ached, gin dulled the pain. For the hawker who trudged through muddy streets from dawn to dusk, gin lent a moment of relief. For the mother with a restless child and no food to quiet it, gin offered sleep, even if dangerous. It was medicine, it was comfort, it was an illusion of power in a world that gave the poor little control. Still, the consequences were heavy. Drunkenness became a daily sight. Quarrels in alleys turned to blows, and blows turned to bloodshed. The courts filled with cases of theft, assault, and neglect, many tied to the spirit. One magistrate wrote that the drink inflames the blood and turns quarrels to blows and blows to murder. Constables grew wary of patrolling on Saturday nights when wages were spent and the streets echoed with laughter that often soured into cries. The image that most haunted reformers was that of women drinking. In earlier times, public drunkenness had been seen as a failing of men, but gin crossed that boundary. Women drank openly, sold gin from their homes, and in the harshest tales, gave it to their infants to keep them silent. Pamphlets railed against the mother gin, a figure who represented both the seduction of drink and the neglect of children. Hogarth's engraving of Gin Lane captured this terror with brutal clarity. A mother so lost to her drunken stupor that her child slipped from her arms toward the cobblestones below. These images were exaggerated, no doubt, sharpened for moral effect. Yet they reflected a truth. Gin blurred the lines of duty and care. Infants died not only from poverty but from spirits slipped into their milk. Children wandered the streets in rags, sent to fetch gin with the last coin of the household. Young boys and girls grew up seeing drunkenness as ordinary, and many followed the same path. The city itself seemed altered by the craze. Foreign visitors wrote with shock of London's excess. They described alleys filled with staggering figures, voices rising in quarrel, the smell of spirits hanging over the markets. They compared London to no other place in Europe, calling it uniquely and strangely in love with gin. To them it was as though the city had abandoned reason, had descended into a dream of drunkenness. And yet, London did not collapse. Even in Gin Alley, life carried on. The market still bustled with cries of "Be my oysters," hot pies, fresh bread. Children still played, their games echoing between walls. Tradesmen still plied their work, repairing shoes, hammering iron, sewing garments. Amid the ruin there was resilience. Gin was destructive, but it did not erase the will to endure. The government, alarmed, attempted again and again to intervene. Laws were passed to raise the price of gin, to limit who might sell it, to tax its production. Each law met resistance. Sellers disguised their trade, buyers ignored the rules, and riots broke out when enforcement grew too harsh. At times the laws seemed only to inflame the problem, driving gin underground and making it more alluring. It was not until the Gin Act of 1751 that real change began. By then, the fever had begun to ebb on its own. Food prices had risen, making bread a higher priority, and the novelty of gin had worn thin. Ale regained its place, tea grew more common, and coffee houses multiplied. Slowly, the grip of gin loosened. The number of sellers declined, and the city settled into a new balance. Yet the memory of Gin Alley lingered. It lingered in sermons, in pamphlets, in Hogarth's prints that still hang today. It lingered in the warning passed to later generations. That drink, unchecked, could unravel the threads of society. Close your eyes now and imagine the alley once more. The noise has faded. The doors of the dram shops are shut. A thin wind sweeps down the lane, carrying the faint smell of smoke. The people are gone, their voices silenced by time, their footsteps erased from the cobblestones. What remains is a lesson, not of despair but of endurance. London endured as it always has, reshaping itself from chaos into something new. And as you drift deeper into rest, let the nightmare of Gin Alley dissolve into the distance, leaving you with only the gentle hum of history, steady and soft, carrying you towards sleep. London in the mid-18th century seemed to carry two faces. One face, gilded and proud, belonged to the city of merchants, noblemen, lawyers, and rising bankers. The other, worn down and distorted, belonged to the swelling neighbourhoods where poverty and gin lived side by side. It is in the second face, shadowed by alley smoke and littered by broken bottles, where our story lingers. The gin craze did not merely arrive and vanish quickly. It became embedded, like damp in stone, creeping into every corner of daily life. And by the 1740s, London's poorer districts had grown noisier, dirtier, and more crowded than ever before. Migration from the countryside continued, and families who had once worked small plots of land found themselves crammed into lodging houses where entire households shared single rooms. Into these overfilled streets flowed barrels of cheap gin, carried by cartwheels that rumbled day and night. The sound of those carts was familiar to anyone in the city. Hooves striking cobblestones, wood creaking under weight, and the smell of spirits leaking into the air before the kegs were even opened. To walk through such streets was to notice the way gin inserted itself into every hour. Early in the morning, one could see women sipping from tin mugs before facing a day of laundry or labour. At midday, men fresh from the docks or workshops paused for a quick draught that blurred the ache of their backs. In the evenings, fires glowed behind crooked doors and drinkers slumped against walls, some singing, some silent. Children carried little cups, and in some cases, even babies were fed spirits mixed with milk to quiet their cries. This was not a tale invented by pamphleteers to stir moral outrage. Court records, parish notes, and observations from travellers all confirm the sight of children raised in an atmosphere where gin was as common as bread. Yet the problem was not only what people drank, but how society reacted. The governing classes looked down on this uncontrolled consumption with alarm. though their own tables often carried bottles of wine, brandy, or punch. Wine was a gentleman's drink imported from France or Portugal, expensive enough to act as a marker of class. Brandy too carried refinement, associated with merchants and officers. But gin was different. It was the drink of the labourer, the laundress, the beggar, the prisoner. It was cheap, flavoured with juniper to disguise harshness, and available almost anywhere. It blurred the line between necessity and escape, between remedy and ruin. One must imagine the sound of these places, not silence, but a steady chorus of human need. Children shouting, carts rumbling, the occasional hymn spilling from a church, and always the murmur of drunken conversation. At night, the volume increased and arguments sparked easily. Some of these ended in brawls, others in broken bones, and sometimes in death. Court dockets from the 1740s and 1750s are full of cases of assaults linked to drunkenness. The law could punish individuals, but the larger flood of gin seemed beyond reach. Pamphleteers warned of moral decline. Preachers thundered from pulpits. Artists like William Hogarth captured scenes of ruin in his engravings, none more famous than his vision of Gin Lane, where mothers dropped their infants and houses collapsed under decay. Such images spread rapidly through London, pinned to tavern walls and sold in streets, shaping the imagination of those who saw them. Yet even as the message circulated, the gin trade endured. The government had attempted to regulate earlier, passing laws in 1729, 1736, and 1743. Each law sought to limit production, raise duties, or restrict licensing. Each faced resistance. Sellers defied regulations, often supported by communities who valued their access to cheap drink. Riots erupted when collectors or constables tried to seize stills or shut doors. The attempt of 1736, which imposed high duties, became especially notorious. Crowds mocked officials, shouting that gin was their comfort and their right. They composed rhymes declaring gin a friend in hard times. Enforcement proved impossible when much of the population viewed the law as an enemy. By the 1750s, however, changes began to stir. Not through sudden moral awakening, but through a combination of forces. Grain prices rose, making the raw materials of gin more expensive. At the same time, the government improved enforcement by reforming licensing and policing. Campaigners like Henry Fielding argued passionately for order, writing pamphlets that painted gin not merely as a private vice, but as a danger to the entire nation. He described families torn apart, labour wasted, crime increased, and health destroyed. His words carried influence not only in pamphlet form, but also in his role as magistrate. Slowly the trade declined. The flood became a river, the river narrowed to a stream. But before that decline, London experienced years that seemed to many like an age of despair. In those days, hospitals recorded cases of delirium tremens, though they did not yet use the modern term. Men and women arrived trembling, sweating, hallucinating. Some described devils chasing them. Others spoke of voices whispering from the shadows. Physicians recorded these observations with clinical detail, but one can imagine the fear experienced by patients whose minds no longer matched reality. Prisons too were crowded with gin drinkers who had turned to theft to fund their habits. In jail, they received less gin, but often smuggled it in through corrupt guards or sympathetic visitors. The streets of London were a theatre of contrasts. In one square, a grand townhouse with carriages waiting outside. In another, barely a few streets away, alleys where lantern light barely touched the ground and where gin sellers ladled drink in cracked mugs. The smell of roasting meat from a wealthy kitchen could drift downwind to mingle with the stench of refuse and spilled spirits in poorer quarters. This closeness sharpened the sense of unease among the governing classes, who feared that chaos might spill over into their own neighbourhoods. What is striking, when looked at slowly, is how normal it all seemed to those who lived through it. To us, the accounts of women feeding gin to infants appear shocking. To them, it was a way to quiet hunger or illness when other remedies were scarce. To us, the idea of drinking from morning to night sounds extraordinary. To them, it was part of enduring exhausting labour, cold winters, or grief. Gin was not simply pleasure, it was comfort, medicine, and escape, all wrapped in one. Yet comfort can become cage. The more people relied upon it, the more their lives were shaped around the pursuit of another mug. In that dependence lay the real tragedy. Work declined, debts rose, and children grew neglected. Parish records show rising numbers of abandoned infants left at foundling hospitals, many of them weak or sickly, their mothers unable to care for them. Though gin cannot be blamed for every hardship, its role was deeply entwined. Through all this, London continued to grow. Its population swelled, trade expanded, ships carried goods to and from the colonies. Coffee houses bustled with debate, theatres staged plays, newspapers circulated widely. Side by side with this culture of energy and enterprise lived the quieter, darker world of gin alleys, often hidden but always present. The two sides of London did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, creating a city of sharp contrasts where brilliance and ruin shared the same streets. To think of London in the 1700s is to picture not only grandeur but also ordinary lives carried along by forces larger than themselves. The gin craze was not a single story of excess, but a collective memory of a city searching for relief in difficult times. It tells us about inequality, about class, about the struggle to regulate human desire. It also tells us about endurance, for the craze eventually passed, and Londoners found other ways to live, though drink remained a companion in many forms. And so, as we drift through these alleys in thought, it is easy to imagine the lantern light dimming, the voices quieting, the sound of distant church bells mixing with the echo of mugs clinking. History does not end with a single moment. It fades slowly like the smoke of a candle after flame. The people of London carried on, as people always do, with habits, with hopes, with failures, with strength. Their world may seem distant to us now, yet the shadows of their gin-soaked nights still linger in the stories they left behind. As we drift further along the shadowed alleys of 18th century London, the story of gin does not end with the first warnings, the first laws, or the first moral cries. Instead, it swells like a tide, creeping into every corner of the city until even the stones seem to drink with the people. What had begun as a cheap comfort, a liquid escape from the burden of poverty and labour, had by the mid-18th century turned into something larger, something both feared and unavoidable. The tale of Gin Lane, as William Hogarth's engravings later imagined, was not a single picture, but a slow unfolding nightmare that lingered across decades. To understand this stage of London's descent, we must picture not only the narrow courts and alleys where bottles were passed and infants sipped from spoons, but also the grander streets where merchants, politicians, and reformers debated in taverns, discussing how to stop what seemed like a plague without cure. For gin had become not just a drink, but a subject of constant dispute, an enemy, a companion, a tax revenue, and a cultural emblem, all at once. By the 1740s, consumption was staggering. Some estimates claimed that the average Londoner, counting men, women, and children together, consumed many gallons of gin each year. Shops selling it were not hidden dens but commoners' bakeries, with signs inviting the weary and the desperate. A drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, clean straw for nothing. It is easy to imagine a passerby unable to resist, for the very advertisement offered oblivion as if it were a blessing. The atmosphere of the city became saturated with these temptations. In the rookeries of St. Giles, in the squalid courts off Holborn, in the crowded districts near the river, gin was poured as steadily as water. One could hear, late into the night, the clatter of pewter mugs, the cries of drunken quarrels, and the eerie laughter of those who had lost their senses. Fires glowed faintly from hearths where women mixed gin with herbs to sell as patent remedies. The smoky haze of coal mingled with the pungent, sweet smell of juniper, and London seemed to wear it like a cloak. Yet, even as the poor sank deeper into dependence, the authorities struggled to respond. Parliament passed acts meant to curb the flood, each more severe than the last. But laws alone, written on paper and read aloud in chambers, could not stop the thirst that had taken hold of the streets. The first Gin Act of 1729 imposed duties, but it hardly slowed the trade. Later attempts only pushed gin underground, encouraging clandestine sellers who ladled spirits through hidden openings in shutters or lowered jugs from upstairs windows to waiting customers. Enforcement was patchy, and the thirst of the people was too strong for the law to quench. As this new chapter of the nightmare unfolded, the city itself began to seem divided. On one side were those who called for stricter measures, who believed that morality, order, and the very survival of the workforce depended on sobering the nation. They published pamphlets with lurid illustrations showing mothers dropping their babies in drunken stupors, men collapsing in ditches, and households ruined by the relentless expense of spirits. Hogarth's own Gin Lane would later crystallize this sentiment, but even before his work, the imagery circulated, engravings, sermons, and plays all pointed to the same conclusion, that gin was the great destroyer. On the other side, there were those who defended the drink, whether out of habit, profit, or a simple belief in freedom. Many poor people argued that gin was the only comfort available in their harsh lives, the one warm fire in a city otherwise cold to their suffering. Small shopkeepers who survived by selling a few drams each day resisted the idea that their livelihood should be stripped away. And smugglers, of course, found new opportunities whenever restrictions were tightened, filling the alleys with contraband and counterfeit liquors. The nightmare of gin, then, was not only about intoxication, but about conflict between classes, between lawmakers and common folk, between the ideal of order and the reality of survival. And London, vast and restless, became the stage where this conflict played out year after year, decade after decade. If we stroll slowly through the streets of the 1750s in our imagination, we see the scars of this conflict everywhere, years after year. Churches full of stern sermons, pleading with congregations to resist temptation. Courtrooms where magistrates pronounced judgment on petty sellers, only for others to take their place the next day. Families hollowed out by drink, where children wandered barefoot through alleys, their bellies empty but their lips stained by gin. And above it all, the sense of a city uneasy with itself, caught between progress and decay. It is in this atmosphere that the greatest crisis unfolded. By mid-century, gin had woven itself so deeply into daily life that some believed the English people were doomed to permanent ruin. Writers compared the streets of London to scenes from ancient Rome in its decline, fearing that drunkenness would sap the nation's strength and leave it vulnerable to enemies abroad. The War of Austrian Succession and later conflicts gave this fear new sharpness. How could Britain defend its empire if its soldiers and workers were incapacitated by drink? This fear gave rise to the most notorious legislation of the period, the Gin Act of 1751. Unlike earlier attempts, which relied on high duties and licenses that proved impossible to enforce, this act took a more subtle approach. It reduced duties to make legal gin affordable, while cracking down on unlicensed sellers with greater vigour. But perhaps more importantly, it was accompanied by a wave of propaganda, an orchestrated effort to turn the public mind against gin itself. Pamphlets, sermons, plays and engravings hammered home the message that gin was not merely a drink, but a poison eating away at the heart of society. The effectiveness of this campaign can still be debated, but in the imagination of Londoners, something began to shift. Hogarth's A Gin Lane and its companion A Beer Street presented a contrast that was impossible to ignore. On one side, the horrors of gin, skeletons, madness and ruin. On the other, the wholesome image of beer, supporting robust workers and stable families. These images, though exaggerated, left a deep impression and became iconic symbols of the age. And so slowly, almost imperceptibly, gin's dominance began to wane. It did not vanish. Indeed, it remained a common drink for generations. But the feverish heights of the gin craze subsided. London did not wake up one morning suddenly sober. Rather, over the years, regulations, changing tastes, and the sheer exhaustion of excess pushed the city toward moderation. Gained its place as the staple, and gin retreated from the all-consuming role it had played. Yet the nightmare left scars. Families broken, lives lost, reputations destroyed. All were part of the price paid. The memory of Gin Lane lingered as a warning, a tale told again and again whenever the dangers of drink were discussed. And in the dim corners of taverns where old men muttered into their mugs, one could still hear echoes of that time when gin ruled the city like a tyrant.